Thank you, Keziah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Cooper. I'm the Head of Collections and Exhibitions here at Towner Eastbourne, and I'm the curator of the exhibition Eileen Mayo and Natural History, some of which you can see behind me. I'm sitting in the gallery as we speak, and the exhibition runs here at Towner until Sunday. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This is a collaborative talk between ArtReview and Towner, and it's one of the final events that we're running for the exhibition. I'm really delighted to be sharing this evening with three other knowledgeable and insightful contributors who I will introduce you to shortly. But before I do that, I'll just reiterate some of what Keziah said about the running of this hour's event. I'll do a brief overview of the exhibition and a little bit about Eileen Mayo. And then in turn, each of our speakers will talk for about 10, 12 minutes each. And then towards the end, we'll take questions and a bit more conversational discussion can take place. So as Keziah said, please do pop your questions into the chat and she can field them for us at the end. So to introduce my fellow speakers, I'm pleased to be joined by John Quinn, by Lukey Stanford, and by John Gainsborough. Hello, everyone. Thank you for agreeing to take part in this. It's really nice to see you all. So John Quinn is a writer and physician who's based in Brighton. He writes regularly on arts and literature for ArtReview. He's also written for The Guardian, The Lancet, and for Frieze. His most recent publication was Dr. Quinn, Medicine Man, which came out this year and has been receiving excellent reviews. He's also contributed to John Gainsborough's book, Eileen Mayo. This one here, can I show you? The publication goes along with the exhibition here. And John's going to talk to us a little bit about Mayo, his appreciation of her work and her links to ArtReview. John Gainsborough is a retired architect and, as mentioned, wrote the publication that accompanies this exhibition. As the son of ArtReview's founder, Richard Gainsborough, and Mayo's stepson, he will speak from personal knowledge and experience about Eileen and her work. And following his father's retirement from ArtReview, John also took over as publisher and editor, holding that role during the 1970s. So he brings a wealth of experience of both Mayo's work and of the magazine. Dr. Lukey Stanford is a GP and a medical educator from Bury in Australia. She's the great niece of Eileen Mayo and a collector of her work. She has the single largest private collection of work by Mayo. Lukey also commissioned the Duck Pond Tapestry, which you can see behind me here, working closely with Westdean College in West Sussex here in the UK on perfecting its colours and really working closely with them on the production, ready for it to be woven in the tapestry studio here in England. Lukey brings great knowledge and appreciation of Mayo's work, which we'll look forward to hearing more about shortly. I'm also extra grateful for Lukey being here this evening, as she's just travelled from Australia, so I'm sure is doing battle with jet lag. So thank you so much. Before I hand over to John Quinn, who I think we're going to go over to first, I just want to say a few words about how the exhibition came about at Towner, just to give a bit of context to the show here. It's been a long time in the planning. My first conversation with John Gainsborough was over lunch in 2017, when I was lucky enough to visit his home and see the wonderful collection of Mayo works that the family holds. It covered everything from her lino cuts, the tempera paintings, drawings and illustrations, books, and her stamp designs. It was such a treat to see it. And it's a really exciting moment when you see a collection of works by an artist you know hasn't had the attention that they deserve, certainly in this country at least. And to feel that it's possible to shine a light on their work and share it with a wider audience, as hopefully we've done here at Towner. For me, that was a really exciting and special moment. Like most plans, over the last couple of years, the dates have changed several times. With great patience from the family and everyone involved, I have to say, but we got there in the end. And here we are sitting in the exhibition now. It's sadly nearly at an end. It's gone very quickly, but it has been so well received by our audience, I'm really happy to say. So each of our contributors will obviously talk about Mayo and her background, but just to give you a bit of an overview, she was born in 1906, and her long career saw her working almost entirely through the 20th century. So she overlaps with many of the artists in the Towner collection, which has a strength in modern British art. She studied at the Slade in the 1920s alongside Eileen Mayo and Winifred Knight, for example. And her influences, include Edward Wadsworth, Eric Ravilius, John Nash. Elements of their work can certainly be seen, in hers. But she firmly maintained her own style and her own direction. Whilst establishing her own artistic path, she worked as a model for the artists Laura and Charles Knight, going down to Cornwall with them throughout the late 1920s and becoming one of their favourite sitters. Through an introduction by Laura Knight to the publisher Cyril Beaumont, Mayo began receiving commissions for illustrations for book publications. And then through her association with the Grosvenor School and Claude Flight, she started exhibiting her lino cuts at the Redfern Gallery. And this really marked the start of her kind of professional artistic career. It was her skill across such a wide range of media that drew me to Mayo. Her perfectionism and her work ethic are also fascinating, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that as we go through this presentation. Despite leaving the UK to live first in Australia and then New Zealand, she maintained such a strong commitment to her work. So our aim really at Towner was to put Mayo back in her rightful place in conversations about modern British art, particularly as an overlooked woman artist, which is very important to me and to Towner, and something that's a really important element of our programming here. In the course of my research, it was fascinating to learn more about her involvement in the setting up of Art News and Review in 1948, as it was known then. And I was so pleased to be able to borrow early examples of the publication from the ArtReview archive to include in the exhibition here. So I'm really looking forward to hearing John talk more about this period. So I will now hand over to John Quinn to talk further about this and his appreciation of Mayo and her work. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's a real thrill and pleasure to be invited to talk to everyone. What I'm going to do, if it's okay, is 3 short readings, 2 clips from the essay that I've contributed to the book, beautiful book, and then lastly, something from the most recent edition of ArtReview. It's 1969, and I'm 8 years old. I collect stamps in a book bound in red leather. Pocket money is spent on Paraguayan images of astronauts and snapshots of JFK from the Gulf states. And near the front of the album are stamps from Australia. These utterly intrigued the boy I once was. Animals I've never seen or heard of before. An olive green platypus diving underwater. An odd cross between an otter and a duck, value 1 shilling. A leaping brown kangaroo goes for 9p, an orange tiger cat for 8p. These stamps come from September 1959 to 1962. I like them very much. 1999, I'm 38 years old, and I'm with my colleague and friend Nicola at a meeting held by the Royal College of Physicians. When it ends, I tell her about Chris Ofili's amazing paintings and show at the Victoria Miro Gallery, and we cab across town and catch it before heading back to Brighton. Nicola likes the paintings very much. I'm gibbering on and then say something about writing for ArtReview. Nicola stands back in surprise and announces, "What? My grandfather and his wife Eileen started up Art News and Review." as they did in 1949, and the magazine still thrives in the 21st century. 2021, I'm 60. Nicola and I have now both retired from the Royal Sussex County Hospital and the NHS, and she's showing me online a collection of images and artifacts I've never seen before: paintings, lithographs, fonts, illustrated books, stamp designs, all the work of Eileen Mayo. I'm gobsmacked. Here is that duck-billed platypus I'd stuck in my stamp album more than 50 years before, and I'm immediately transported back in time. I can remember fixing it on the empty page and recall the gummy sweet taste of the hinge, the quiet pleasures of collecting, and the joy in knowing more about nature and the world. Here then were designs by Eileen Mayo that I'd known from decades before. So that was how I came to know about Eileen Mayo, and the coincidence of writing for ArtReview and working all those years with Nikki and not actually knowing the connection. There's a small detail from Eileen's biography that I'd quite like to just highlight, that when she was at the Slade, she was taught by the surgeon Henry Tonks, and Tonks actually worked in the hospital that Nicola and I worked in, the Royal Sussex County, so another coincidence. Eileen described Tonks as a terrifying but good teacher. If he didn't like your work, he'd say, "Do you like knitting?" Or, "Why don't you go home and do your knitting?" Tonks was a veteran of World War I, and clearly a damaged man. He was also reported as saying, "There's no drawing without tears." And his images of the battle scar still trouble. I saw these first, I think, after reading an essay on him by Robert Hughes or maybe Jonathan Meads. Tonks knew beauty too, and he passed his love of great draftsmanship onto Eileen. Her work generally skirts the traumas of the 20th century and more reflects a Matissean joy about life and its multifarious beauties. Hers is a landscape of pleasure. Now I just want to say something from the most recent summer edition of ArtReview, in your shops now. I didn't write this. This is the up-to-date editorial, which is called "The Good Old New Normal." When ArtReview launched back in 1949, its front covers were dedicated to self-portraits of the artists it featured in its pages, of which the pages, there were not many, so each issue tended to feature a lengthy appreciation of one artist. The rest would be dedicated to news and reviews, in keeping with the magazine's title at that point, Art News and Review. Often the portraits were produced specifically for the magazine. I doubled down, if you like, on the magazine's presentation of artists as modern-day heroes when it came to rethinking art's embeddedness in the reshaping of culture and society in the post-war and post-colonial era. Of course, you could argue that the process of creating heroes was to some degree a throwback to the art historical traditions of earlier eras. And in as much as it extended the concept of artists as lone geniuses, a contradiction to any attempt to position art at the heart of any form of social rebuilding. But in a way it was and is an accurate reflection of the way art engages with different and often contradictory value systems, those dictated by the market and those dictated by the social implications of creating. Fast forward to now, and nothing's changed. These are the overlapping value systems that ArtReview continues to navigate, giving you the lowdown on individual artistic practice and attempting to connect that to wider social and intellectual movements in the world at large. And it still occasionally has portraits of individual artists on its cover. The one on this issue is by an artist, not of an artist, by the way. Although ArtReview does like to think it's learned a thing or two along the way, even if at times it's not exactly sure what. So that's from, as I say, the current edition of ArtReview, reflecting on its principles, if you like, when it started and what it stands for now. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was it was really interesting to learn both about the coincidences and the connections. I think this exhibition has brought out quite a few of those that have come out in the planning and the kind of the production of the show over this last couple of years. It's been fascinating, but it's also really interesting to hear you talk about the kind of the development of ArtReview. As I say, we do have some examples of those archive books here in the show, and just looking through those sort of and thinking about sort of Eileen's contribution to them at the beginning was really fascinating and enlightening, and seeing her kind of portrait of the artist was which we have borrowed from the Tate it's really a fantastic work. So great to have all that in the show and to have you talk a bit more about it. And I think that's a really nice place to bring John Gainsborough into this, to sort of give some of his insights into perhaps the early days of setting up when the magazine was set up. John, can I hand over to you?
Yes. In the very early days, I would refer quickly to John Quinn's comment about Portrait of the Artist. That was very important to my father because he believed in drawing as the very first thing. That was the most interesting part of any work to him. But actually what happened was that he didn't actually commission Portrait of the Artist. He asked the artist to do a self-portrait. They would get the front cover, and at the end of the day, the self-portraits would be given to a national collection. He didn't pay for them. And when he died very suddenly on a train outside Brighton, after that, I gave the entire collection to the Tate archive. So that had quite a history. And the Tate, under Nicholas Sirota, gave the self-portraits a complete exhibition of their own at the Tate, which was wonderful for them. And they're still there now, and Eileen's portrait is one of them. I would like to talk a tiny bit about Eileen herself, because a number of people have said, well, what was she like as a stepmother? Well, I mean, she was she was a stepmother. All I can say is she was extremely serious. I never heard her crack a joke ever. She worked incredibly hard. And the reason there aren't quite so many paintings, literally paintings tempera or oil or water, she never did watercolor, is because the dominant thing in the beginning of her career was the book, and the book was the story of living things. There is a copy in the exhibition, but you only see 2 pages of it. It took a tremendous amount of her time. And someone asked me only yesterday, why didn't she do more landscapes or pictures like Fletching Mill? And really, I think it was because she was so preoccupied with the book, which didn't come out till about 1946 under wartime printing conditions. So that was interesting. One other tiny thing, which a number of people have been puzzled by, is why Art News and Review turned into Arts Review, which ultimately turned into ArtReview. Well, originally it was Art News and Review, and Eileen did the graphics for it. My father then discovered there was an American journal called Art News, and he was concerned about copyright, so he promptly changed the title to Arts Review. It did exactly the same job as the first title said. What was in the can was in the can. News, reviews, information. He believed, he retired. The concept of Arts Review came about because he could not find any information about art galleries, art exhibitions, lectures on art in the national press. And he said, this is silly because, you know, why can't we start a journal that provides us information? And he did. It was very simple. It was monochrome. Eileen designed it. I wasn't in on the discussions at all to do with it. I was at college. And it was produced. And in those days, you could produce a journal for relatively little funding. He did have funding to cover it, of course. And he decided on a fortnightly operation. One of the very amusing things is that he got it distributed in a clumsy sort of way around one or two outlets in London, but his key outlet was a little news vendor who had everything on the wall behind him in Sloane Square, the south side of Sloane Square. He went to see this chap, he took the ArtReview, and every so often my father would walk along from Royal Avenue, Chelsea, to this guy and say, well, how's it doing? And this was his market research. And in the end, he found that, of course, he actually established a niche market for ArtReview. And it's gone on from there, as John says, it still survives. And it survives because the original concept was that you can always sell information. And all the information about the galleries and the lectures and everything was there. My father was pleased. He had all the information he needed. He had an occupation and he ran it for years. And finally, sadly, he died very suddenly on a train. I was in practice of a sort. The magazine was ready to come out the next week. What do I do? So I dropped everything, took it on, and carried it on, really, A, to save the title, and B, to save the staff who had been very loyal to him from the outset. So that's it. But Eileen was dedicated. She worked incredibly hard. She 9 to 5, never worked at night, by the way, never ever. She always had a good room in the house, whichever house she was living in. And as you see from that splendid portrait by Hoppy, which was from his estate in Pasadena, she was a remarkably attractive woman, and she was a very good model for, as John mentioned, Dame Laura Knight and Dodd Proctor. And of all the pictures of her, which Sarah managed to borrow from public collections, the picture of Eileen by Dodd Proctor sums her up for me. Serious, mean, you know, looking very intense at things. And it's altogether a very nice portrait indeed. That's not to say that Harold Knight's is a magnificent picture too, but it was nice to have them. And of course, the exhibition has been made by Lucci's commission of the tapestry called Duck Pond. We're not now sure whether they are ducks. They may be geese of some sort. They're highly decorative. And a Canadian friend of mine came to see it, and he said, well, John, they might be loons. And I'd heard of loons, but I'd never seen them. But anyway, it is a marvelous work. We should be sorry to see it go, but we've had the pleasure of seeing it. And I hope, Lucci, you thoroughly enjoy it in your house in Bury when you get back. I'm happy to help take questions later when you come to those. And that's my bit. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear a sort of the background from your perspective to the setup of Art News and Review. I was just wondering, I was quite interested in how the information about the exhibitions was gathered, because there was obviously quite a lot to include.
Oh yes, very quickly, pre-computers, no computers at all. They devised a little postcard with literally dates, exhibitor, exhibition, and so on. They were sent out to every gallery, certainly in London and later in the provinces. The galleries, it was in their interest to fill them up. So I think we virtually had 100% returns. And the information was derived from those cards. There were stacks of these cards. And then once they'd been done, we were on to the next lot. So it was quite a job, and everything had to be collated by hand. I do remember there was a lovely lady who did it for us, smoked like a chimney, but it produced the goods and everybody was pleased, the galleries were pleased. And we also used it for the gallery guide, which was a poster we put up. That was a double crown poster we put up in the tube. I can't remember how many we put up, but we subsequently developed that poster idea to give information. For example, very quickly, we realized that publishers only gave poster publicity to their top authors, but we gave publicity to other authors by splitting up the poster and giving them all a go. So we were very used to developing information in various ways, and including the yearbook, which had, we did that yearbook, or we developed that, which is full of information as to print galleries, print makers, galleries, and so on. So that was a development of the whole publishing operation that we did. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up too much time.
No, not at all. No, it was really interesting. I was fascinated to imagine how they gathered so much information together by hand. Rather, it seems sort of, I don't know, everything done by email these days. That seems like a huge undertaking. So yeah, I'll hand, as we were sort of moving on to talk about the tapestry, it feels like a really nice time to bring in Lucy to talk a bit more about that and the commission and your kind of knowledge and love of Eileen Mayo and her work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the two Johns. And it's interesting that Eileen, I guess, worked their way into both their childhoods as she did into mine. So even though I grew up, very far from England in Australia, Eileen's work really became imprinted on me because my parents really loved her work, and they had purchased from Eileen quite a number of prints from the period that she was working on, a lot of prints, mainly in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Eileen was my grandmother's sister on my father's side. And I do remember visiting Eileen in New Zealand as a child. When we would go to visit my grandmother for family holidays, we'd visit Eileen as well in her studio and having discussions about her work and so on. But I think my father had a lot of respect and love for Eileen. He came from New Zealand to Australia when he finished school to study vet science because they didn't offer it in New Zealand at that time. And at that time, Eileen was living in Sydney and she was his only family. And so I think he felt that she was somebody who was actually very honest and had seen a lot of the world. And he really admired her work. I think the other common thread that has kind of passed down the family, so Eileen's father, my grandmother's father too, had studied at Cambridge. He was blessed with 3 daughters, passionately believed in education, and he would take them on nature rambles. He would teach them the botanical names of plants and animals and so on. And I think that really very much became part of Eileen's career, really. And if we look at even the title of this exhibition and the subject of her work, it was very much, I think, tied back to that childhood. And if I reflect on my childhood, it was also one of being in the bush and learning the botanical names of a lot of plants and so on. And my father's a vet, and so that love of animals as well. I also grew up collecting stamps, John, and in my collection, I had those exact same pre-decimal stamps, and I had no idea when I was gluing them down into my album that they were by my great aunt, but I loved them too. But now in my one of the rooms in my house, I actually have the original watercolor designs that were made for the engraver, and they're very beautiful works and were quite groundbreaking for their time, because she was really one of the first stamp designers to show animals that were actually in their natural habitat and they were actually moving. So that platypus is actually swimming through the water, and they were quite revolutionary for their time. So just rewinding back to my childhood, growing up with pictures on the wall, and then growing up to leave home, and I became a doctor. And really those pictures were left behind in my parents' house. But rewinding 20 years ago, I had a newborn baby, and I was walking her in a pram at a seaside market, and there was a secondhand bookstore, and sitting on the top of a pile of secondhand books was a copy of one of Eileen's books. It was the one John referred to, which was really her great work and tome, The Story of Living Things and Their Evolution. And it was there in perfect condition with its dust jacket. And it was $2, so £1. I couldn't quite believe it, but that was the first piece that came into my collection. And then it's interesting hearing the manual labour and involved in collecting information with the ArtReview, but it was really the internet that changed my collection. And when secondhand books became widely available, I started looking for Eileen's other books and found them. And then something triggered me to type her name into eBay one day, and this would be probably about 17 years ago, and up popped a print. It was a lithograph, and it was in the UK, and I got it. It was £75, an amazing bargain, and actually an amazing coincidence, because since then, perhaps only ever one or two of her works in my 20 years of collecting have ever popped up on eBay. So I think that was meant to be. And it just took me down this rabbit hole of discovery, of learning about her and her works. I knew she had a stepson. I knew he was called John Gainsborough. And John, I'll tell you, I even tried to stalk John Gainsborough, but I knew very little else apart from he was somewhere in the UK, and there are quite a few John Gainsboroughs. I didn't even know if he was still alive. But what happened one day is I stumbled across a little cache of works that were being sold by an art dealer across the road from the British Museum. And there were 6 of Eileen's works, which is very unusual to find that many at once. And not only that, there were 6 that spanned a large period of time. 3 of them were still available, and I snatched them all up and asked the dealer if he knew the provenance and where they'd come from. And he said, oh, they're from the artist's family. I said, well, that's quite extraordinary, because so am I. And I asked a little bit more, and they explained that they were from the artist's stepson. And I thought, wow, I found him. But I wonder why he's selling these works, but I would love to get in touch. And so I asked the dealer whether he would pass on a letter, which he did. And within 24 hours, I had an email from John explaining why they'd come onto the market for a very good reason. And it's lovely that they're still in the family, but it started this connection, and it really accelerated my collection. So over the years, I've acquired well over 100 of Eileen's works, including a lot of things that are very much, I guess, behind the scenes, not just works that were intended for exhibition, but working drawings. One of the great treasures is a nature diary that she did when she was 12 years old. The Tate Archive has a photocopy of that, but the original is in Bury in Australia. It would definitely be one of the ones I would tuck under my wing if the house was burning down. And the journey's also taken me all over the world, meeting really fascinating people who have also shared an interest with Eileen. The tapestry. So it kind of came to light that a tapestry existed. I knew about it from a PhD thesis that had been written about Eileen, and I was communicating with John, and he said he knew more. He knew there was one tapestry that had been woven and that it was held in a private collection in the UK, in Newcastle. And he'd actually managed to send one of his grandsons to knock on the door of the person who owned it to go and take some photographs, which was wonderful. And when we were talking together, communicating, hatching a plan for this exhibition, and because the idea was to focus on the UK period of Eileen's works, I did say that wouldn't it be wonderful if we could showcase her interest in tapestries, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we could borrow the tapestry in Newcastle? That plan didn't come off. The tapestry was not available for loan. And then John came up with this wonderful idea of maybe weaving a copy of that same tapestry. But that hit a bit of a dead end because the original studio that wove it in Dovecote, there was, I think it was a 6-figure quote, wasn't it, John? Quite extraordinary. And I also consulted an art academic who'd written the PhD on Eileen, and she felt that we could run into some issues by creating a second tapestry. It might diminish the work of the existing one. So that could be a bit problematic. But there were a few other designs that we knew about. And in fact, about 11 years ago, I found on the US market at auction a cartoon, the one that you see, the design that you see behind Sarah there, which was actually labelled or titled the Duck Pond when I purchased it. Now I think it should have been perhaps Goose Pond, and Eileen would be horrified if we had misnamed the birds. She was definitely very precise. And so the idea was hatched that maybe we could actually weave Duck Pond into a tapestry. There aren't many tapestry studios left in the world. I'm here to tell you, I've discovered that. There is one in Australia, it's in Melbourne, the Melbourne Tapestry Studio. So I approached them about the project. They were very excited, but they have a very strict policy of only weaving tapestries of living artists. And I respect that. And I actually think Eileen would have too, because I think she was a great believer in bringing this craft back to life. So we tried the avenue of a private weaver, but there aren't many, and they tend to weave their own designs. And then we found out about Westdean Studio, which happily is in Sussex. So John was wonderful. He did the groundwork, went and met with the studio, presented this potential project, and I was just thrilled that they were agreeable to take it up. And behind you can see the work, which I've only seen in images. I'm so excited to be coming on Sunday, which is actually my birthday. So it'd be the best birthday present ever to see it in person. And then to bring it back home where it will be sitting beside the cartoon, which was made over 75 years ago. And I like to think that Eileen would be moved and touched that this has happened and that this has been realised all these years later.
Thank you so much. It was, fascinating and really interesting to hear more about your connections to Eileen. Again, a sort of story filled with connections and coincidences, and if you haven't found that work on eBay 17 years ago, and
and the book at the market,
exactly, just those chance occurrences that have happened with this exhibition that make it sort of all the more special than it was already. I think it's really nice, and we're really looking forward to having you here on Sunday and to showing you the tapestry in person, definitely. Thank you to all three of you for those kind of words, and providing a little bit more insight into your own appreciation of Mayo's work and your knowledge of kind of her history. I think we can now go over to take some questions. If there are any, Keziah, that would be great. Otherwise, we can just kind of open it out to a wider conversation.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but we can open it up now if anyone wanted to raise their hand and ask live.
If there's none for a minute, I've got a couple that popped up while people were speaking, if I should get the ball rolling. John Quinn, sorry. I was really interested in thinking about kind of writing now and the kind of the staff and the team that work there. Do you think there's a kind of an awareness or an appreciation of the history and the heritage of the magazine? Particularly, I think there was just was it 70 years fairly recently. So is that something that kind of that people think about, that you know matters to people that work there now?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that was a big thrill for Nicola and I was to go up to the ArtReview offices, where they have you know, an extensive archive. And you know, people talk about the importance of archives. They are very important. And so Nicola and I spent several hours going through these early editions and, you know, finding some of the illustrations that subsequently are in the exhibition in the vitrines. But that in itself, you know, then makes you think, well, just because an artist might be forgotten now or, you know, is ignored, in the future, that's not necessarily going to be the case. And so, you know, looking at, of course, we got diverted. You would then find magazine, you know, art reviews from the 1960s that maybe had some of the initial discussions on pop art, etc. So, you know, maintaining an archive is super important. And yeah, you know, the magazine is very, very aware of the importance of doing that and how fashion comes in and out. And if you've got that information to hand that you just go back to, you can cross-reference back. You know, art is not science, and that, you know, it's not a case of you know, putting a reference like an academic article. And I think that's what makes art history endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. You know, definitely we have a kind of vast sort of archive of our own sort of artists and collection material that's, you know, as important as in some ways as the artists we hold in the collection. It tells the story of the growth of in your case, you know, the magazine, and in our case, a kind of collection and an organization. And it really pieces that history and lets you tell those stories for the future, doesn't it? Nikki, I don't if you're happy to speak, but Nikki, how did you feel going through that archive with John?
It was very moving, actually, to think that my grandfather had set up this magazine, and I can remember visiting the offices as a child and helping out a little bit, and it was all paper and huge telephones and, you know, dusty shelves, but it was a living, busy, fantastic magazine that developed and evolved over time, I think, both as Richard and then later my father developed it, and spread its wings into video production, arts video as well. Patrick Herony and Findlay, you know, there was a lot of work done. So it was, and seeing the archives was just fantastic, and finding bits, particularly about Eileen, in the preparation and the planning for this exhibition was wonderful. It's very moving, actually. I wanted to take it all home, but, you know, ArtReview have been very generous in their loan, and it's lovely to see. It's wonderful to see. Yeah,
they absolutely have been you know, hugely helpful and generous with the exhibition, and we're really grateful for that. And it was really nice to see in the book the pages about it as well, and just to sort of read a little bit more about how that fitted in with sort of Eileen's life and what she was doing at the time. And John, you said, John Gainsborough, you said that you were away at college at the time that it was being set up, but do you remember those conversations between Eileen and your father? That, you know, did they talk about it? And...
No, I don't. I just remember the results, because Eileen designed it, and then they put it together, and it would have been they send the reviews off, and they come back in long strips of galley, and they send off a few pictures, not too many because they're expensive, to have blocks made, which was separate. And then the whole thing was assembled in the office, which was the house, the first floor of the house in Royal Avenue, number 33. And it was all done on the floor. The printer would supply these great blank sheets, and the galleries would be cut up. In fact, I have here the scissors, the very scissors, which we used, very long, as you see. And the galleries were cut up and pasted down, and the pictures were pasted in. Or no, I don't even think the pictures were pasted in, they're just numbers at the time. They were put in later by the printer. And I believe that the very first copies were set on a machine called Linotype. Linotype was an American machine, typesetting machine, which came into this country about 1900. And just as an aside, my grandfather was an engineer, and he was ace at operating the Linotype machine and maintaining it. What actually happened with that was you had two cases up above containing the matrices of every letter. The front case, uppercase, the back case, lowercase. That's where the terms came from. He would type, the matrices would come down and form a line. Right next door to him, praise be the health and safety, there was a boiling pot of type metal, God knows what temperature. That was poured in, and you'd get a slug of type, and you kept going. The difficulty with it was if there was a mistake, you either had to redo the line or you ignored it. And I think in the main, they ignored it. But it was a very physical business. Somebody said, there's lots of paper around in the office. There was masses of paper. It's like editing a film, it was all down on the floor, what you didn't want. And if it was just too long, snip, snip, it fitted. So the early part of the establishing that archive was very good news, but it was all physical manual. Much later, they invented a system called monotype, which produced individual type in the same way, and the individual type was assembled, and you could correct that, and it produced a much better result. But yes, thanks to Linotype. That was how ArtReview started.
And
we do have a couple of questions from the attendees.
Oh, great! Yeah, please do.
So one for you is from Anne Bridgewood. Are there any plans for the exhibition to be shown elsewhere?
I would have loved to have toured the show elsewhere. When you put, as we all have here, when you put sort of the research time and your heart into putting something like this together, you really want it to be seen. Sadly, during COVID, there just wasn't, there wasn't sort of the options to set up those kind of touring partnerships with any confidence that we'd be able to see them through. It was an incredibly difficult time, and I think it's a shame because now, coming out of that period, it could have travelled. But we didn't know that at the time, and it's you have to renegotiate your loans and ask ArtReview if we can have their archive for longer. So it all becomes a little bit problematic as time goes on. So sadly not. So people have only got about 4 days to see it in its current kind of togetherness here at Towner, sadly. But what I would have loved to have done as well is to bring together the UK works with some of the works in Australian collections and New Zealand collections, and to see it as a sort of a huge sort of Mayo retrospective one day would be amazing. So maybe.
Great. Another question from Linda Bell. So I think both you, Sarah, and perhaps John Gainsborough could speak on this. Linda says she's very new to Eileen's work. Please, could you say some more about the book that you mentioned? So that was your book, John, and perhaps other books. So Sarah, your book comes to mind, and her work as an illustrator and author.
John, would you like to pick up on a little bit about your own book?
Well, she did several books. She seemed to have books on the go, two or three at a time, as far as I can remember. There was one called Animals on the Farm, which was a Puffin series. There was another one called Shells and How They Live, which was Pleiades books. And then, of course, she was ongoing with the story of living things while she was doing those as a sort of sideline. I can't quite remember if there was anything else, but certainly there were those.
The circus books.
Oh, there was a circus book which she did for a newspaper company, didn't she?
Yeah.
There was a book about the circus.
And the alphabet books and the toy books and the book
Yes,
the Darland
Beaumont.
book of poems.
But Beaumont was a publisher who used her a lot to design graphic design of books. Yes.
And there were small animals of the English countryside and large animals of the English countryside.
Yes, thank you. There were. That's it. That's
and then
right.
the American Carragher illustrated books with
Sally Carragher, One Day on Beetle Rock.
Yeah.
Which she did the American animals, which rather put me in mind of the possible origin of the birds in the tapestry. I mean, they might be American. She knew about American animals, and the book is actually in the exhibition, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and the work
and the original drawing.
Yeah, correct. It's also shown just above it here in the show.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a kind of a large library of Mayo books that she has both written and illustrated for other people.
Yes.
As you say, some of which are on display and some of which are actually still available if you look them up, yes. Which is great. And then obviously, in terms of running alongside the exhibition, there are two books if you want to find out more about sort of Mayo and her life. So as I mentioned at the beginning, John, with a contribution from John Quinn, have written this book on her, which we are selling in the shop and will continue to be sold after the exhibition closes. And then as part of the Modern Women Artists series for Eiderdown Press, I've written a small introduction on Mayo, which is part of a series that's currently 8 books, I think, on women artists. And that's also available. And through that, I just wanted to give a general sort of overview of Mayo, a real introduction to people that don't know her work and aren't aware of her as an artist, to sort of, beautiful illustrations and hopefully a bit more information about her.
Could I just pick up one thing? You have taken one picture from the exhibition with people asking what about where it's going. But you've got one picture which we are loaning to the gallery for 5 years, which is the stage 17, which is one of the fishermen's stages down at New Haven Harbour in Sussex. And that will be seen from time to time, I believe.
Yes, that's right. I was just trying to find it in the book so I could show you the picture, but of course, when you want it, you can't find it. No. So yes, that is I'm very pleased that is staying at Towner for a little while on long-term loan. So we'll sit with some of our collection here, and as John said, be shown and be seen alongside the other works in our collection. So that's a really lovely outcome of the exhibition and kind of maintains our connection to Mayo even when the exhibition closes, as well as the sort of, oh, thank you, perfect. So you can see in John Quinn's, that's the one I was looking for. and that really shows, it's a very similar perspective from one in which Eric Revere painted the same scene at New Haven Harbour. So I think we all felt that was a really appropriate and fitting one to stay a little bit longer at Towner, so it can be seen alongside some of the other works by Revilius and Borden of New Haven. And we'd be delighted to kind of keep these connections going between us all, between John and Lukey and Now we all know of each other and our kind of shared interest in Mayo. I hope the conversations will be ongoing, and yeah, I'll look forward to them in the future. Have we got any more questions? Because I don't want to miss anyone.
We don't have any more questions in the box.
Okay.
We do have a few minutes left if anyone wants to just slip in a last minute.
Yeah, or any questions for each other. It seems a really nice, a nice time that we've got everyone here together. So if there's any kind of comments between you or questions to each other, it'd be really nice to talk about that now.
Could I maybe ask, is it Margaret Cassidy who's the academic who wrote the PhD?
Gillian Cassidy.
And do you know more about what she's doing, or?
Yes, I can tell you. So Gillian is 80. She's retired, well, semi-retired. So she still supervises PhD students. In just pre-COVID, in 2019, there was quite a large exhibition of Eileen's works in Christchurch, which I did go and see. And so Gillian wrote the foreword of a book that the curator for that exhibition wrote, Peter Vangioni. And that's also a lovely book, really summarising Eileen's life. And the graphic design is beautiful in it. It's a lovely publication if you've not seen it. But yes, I'm still in very regular contact with Gillian. She's my go-to person if I ever have an Eileen question. For example, there's a work in this exhibition which was loaned, which was the portrait of a young child's face. But the signature certainly did not look like Eileen. John Gainsborough was quite suspect. I have quite a few, although Eileen didn't do a lot of portraits, she did some. I have quite a few in my collection. So I was able to put those side by side and I guess build a bit of a case as to whether this was likely to be by Eileen or not. I was a true believer it actually was, and probably the name had actually been written in by somebody else. And so that was very useful having Gillian's input on that as well.
Great.
I also was in touch with Gillian when writing the book as well, and sort of she was, enormously helpful and so generous with her knowledge about Eileen, and also with her willingness to share, images and copyright. I mean, that sort of her generosity has allowed a lot of this to happen, and so we should also, express our gratitude to Gillian for everything.
I'm tremendously grateful to Gillian, because without her, I think a lot of knowledge about Eileen would have been lost. And really, she collected so much information, and her PhD is so beautifully written. It really tells a story, and so well researched. Yes.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think we're pretty much at time at 6 o'clock. So I will just take the opportunity to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. Thank you so much. I hope you've learnt more about Eileen Mayo and more about the kind of the origins and the setting up of ArtReview. It's been a pleasure to have our three speakers here to share their knowledge and experience, and I'm really grateful for all of your time on this talk. Thank you so much. Do come and see the show before it closes on Sunday. And also the books are available, as we said. So yes, thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh.